So Dan McClellan put out a video a little while back suggesting that in Deuteronomy 22, the Bible condones sexual assault. He says that these verses show no concern for female consent and that they treat women as property. These are the verses that some people think require rape victims to marry their rapists. If you have any interest in Christianity, this is a big question. The Bible's claim is that God gave these laws in that ancient context, and so Christians, such as myself, believe that these are not just questions of ancient history, they're about how God has interacted with humans in history. So what did the laws mean? And another question, is Dan giving us a full picture of the scholarship on this issue? My name's Andrew. I'm a youth pastor and a grad student, and I'm going to argue against some of Dan's claims. And I also want to show that for one of his major claims, every scholar Dan cites actually disagrees with him. Obviously, there's going to be sensitive content here that is not for children. Please don't watch this if this type of discussion is going to be harmful for you. This is not an easy topic. Sexual violence is one of the most horrifying things that happens. I, for one, am aching to one day live in a better world. But in the meantime, we're asking, what did this passage mean in that ancient context? Here's the passage. We have here 4 if-then style case laws relating to sexual crimes. They concern women who are married, engaged, or single. I'm going to explore 3 of the biggest questions that Dan addressed in his video. Question number 1. Is female sexual consent a material factor for the 2 laws of verses 23 to 27? We have 2 laws here. In the first law, sex happens in the city, the girl does not cry out, and both the man and the woman are condemned for committing adultery. In the second law, the sex happens in a field, the woman cries out, but no one can hear her. She is not punished while the man is. My view is that the distinction here is whether the sex was understood to be consensual. But Dan says this is not what's going on here.
Now, the middle section causes confusion because it divides it into 2 different parts, addressing what happens if it's in a city, what happens if it's in the open field. It has the illusion of addressing consent, but it's not addressing consent because consent wasn't really a thing back then.
He then elaborates on this, saying the view of sex in the ancient world ruled out the idea of female consent. Sex was basically something a man did to a, quote, passive sexual object. And so he says this.
The consent, the autonomy, the agency of the passive sexual object did not matter.
So if these verses are not about consent, what are they about?
It's all about where it happens, irrespective of consent.
He elaborates on this. He says that the woman was against sex happening in both scenarios, but that the woman in the city is condemned because she was in a location where she should have been able to stop it from happening.
In both instances, the woman doesn't want it to happen. But the question is just, is she in a circumstance where she could stop it?
So if I'm understanding Dan correctly here, he thinks the law is saying the woman did not fight back hard enough. The contrast would be between a victim who is loud and one who is not loud enough. The quieter victim is condemned because she should have done more to stop the assault from taking place. Let me give one quick clarification. These case laws are not exhaustive. They are representative. Here on the screen is a quote from Raymond Westbrook where he explains how this works. This is kind of obvious when you think about it, just because the field versus city distinctions are said only about engaged women doesn't mean the same logic would not also apply to married women. It does not mean they couldn't comprehend the idea of rape happening in a city. These are example cases. The question is, what are the examples driving at? Notice that Dan gives no evidence for his claim that consent did not exist in the ancient world. He asks us to assume this premise as we interpret the text, but he has not offered any actual data to support this broad claim about ancient Near Eastern thought. But he does give arguments for the smaller claim about this particular passage. He says that the word for finds in this law, which is matzah, he says that the word finds shows that it was unplanned, implying that this makes it less likely to be consensual. But this is mistaken on two levels. Number one, the word does not require that the finding is unplanned. It can describe someone seeking a consensual romantic encounter. And number two, even if sex is spontaneous, that doesn't prove it's non-consensual. So there's nothing sinister that needs to be read into this word finds. This next part is where we start to see more clearly what's going on. In the city scenario, the man lies with the woman, but in the field scenario, there's a new verb. He forces her and lies with her. Force here is translating the Hebrew root chazak. This word means seize or grasp, and it is language that is used repeatedly in other contexts for scenes of sexual assault. He forces her and lies with her. This is much different from the verbal sequence in the city. So we have lied with versus forced and lied with. Now, look at the outcomes. See how much text goes into affirming the woman's innocence in the field. Everything highlighted here drives home the innocence of the victim. She is compared to a murder victim. The man gets the death penalty and the woman is not punished at all. This is not a distinction between loud victim and not loud enough victim. It is a distinction between a victim and a participant. The whole point of these images of field versus country, crying versus not, is that they are guidelines for discerning whether or not the sex was consensual. So it's very difficult to see how the text of this law can fit with what Dan says it means. But as he concludes his comments on verses 23 to 27, Dan says this.
I'm going to talk about some scholarship that demonstrates that this is not really about consent.
Okay, so Dan says he has scholarship to validate his interpretation of 23 to 27. Well, before the video ends, Dan ends up citing a total of 7 scholars. Do any of them affirm his claim that female consent is not an issue in verses 23 to 27? No, not one of them does. In fact, every single one of them says that consent is the point. They might disagree with one another on how effective this is as a guideline, but every single one of them says that that is what's going on here. Precisely the opposite of what Dan said. I invite you to pause and read the quotes from most of these scholars, but let me comment a little bit on one of them. Dan gave his most emphatic recommendation for Carolyn Pressler's writings on this, which is strange because she is crystal clear that consent is the issue here. She says about verses 22 to 27, she says, these laws look at the question of the treatment of adultery in light of 2 variables. 1, the girl's or woman's marital status, that's the verse 22 part, and 2, her consent or lack of consent to the sexual act. Pressler says stuff like this over and over in the most explicit language. Now, I disagree with Pressler on some significant things, but I want to point out that on these verses, Pressler, like every other scholar that's been cited, explicitly contradicts Dan's view. So while Dan claims this,
it's not addressing consent because consent wasn't really a thing back then.
And this,
I'm going to talk about some scholarship that demonstrates that this is not really about consent.
Every scholar he cites says the opposite. Of course, Dan is free to argue for a minority position, but it is odd that he says there is scholarship supporting his view, and then he offers a list of scholars who unanimously contradict him. So I maintain that the intended distinction between the 2 cases in 23 to 27 is female consent. So this brings us to what is usually the center of the controversy, verses 28 to 29. Now, I'll explain later why, if we look closely, this text does not seem to force marriage on women at all. But first, we want to ask, what are we talking about here? Are verses 28 to 29 addressing a case of rape? Dan says yes, clearly.
There's absolutely no case to make from the Hebrew that this is not referring to sexual assault or rape.
Now, there is, in fact, scholarly discussion on this question. A lot of scholars agree with Dan's position that these are talking about rape. Others disagree. I am personally not 100% sure. Again, no one is being forced to marry their rapist either way, but I think that the evidence is much more complicated than someone might think after watching Dan's video. It's really important to me to follow the evidence, and so I want to share some of the evidence that cuts against Dan's position. There is a word in the text that can seem to lend toward Dan's view. It says the man lay hold on her. This translates a new Hebrew word, tafas. This word is often translated as to seize or to lay hold of. So Dan takes it as rape, and he argues that by talking about how this verb is used with personal versus impersonal objects. But notice this. Dan hasn't shown any instance outside this verse where the word refers to any sexual relationship at all, whether consensual or forced. So how can we know what it means here? We need to look at the context. So here are some contextual indicators which would seem to argue against it being a forced encounter. Number one, the context shows a concern for female consent with respect to sex. Since female consent so clearly matters in verses 23 to 27, in everyone's view except for Dan's, shouldn't we require strong contrary evidence to suppose that consent suddenly does not matter if the woman is single? Reason number two, the description in 28 to 29 is drastically different from the undisputed rape law in 25 to 27. Remember all this emphasis in the earlier law on the lack of consent. And now look at everything that might possibly be taken to indicate a lack of consent in verses 28 to 29. Like, I'm not trying to be biased, but this would be unbalanced, right? Like, if they're talking about the same action just against a different person, why is it said so emphatically in the one law, and then down in the other law, it's just a single verb, and that verb does not have the same associations with sexual assault as chazak does? Different marital status strikes me as an unsatisfactory explanation. Number three, being discovered is the language in this passage used for a consensual hookup. In verse 22, I'm not talking about the plural subject. I'm talking about the verb itself. It is not used for the rape scenario. It is used for a consensual affair with a married woman. And by the way, in 25 to 27, how is the rape known to the authorities? It is clearly through female reporting. The law assumes that female reports of assault were to be believed unless there was contrary evidence. But as for them being discovered, this language is used in this context for consensual sex. So the immediate context gives us these yellow flags against the rape interpretation. What about the culture? Did this society care about the violation of single women? That's what we'll see in number 4. The Hebrew Bible elsewhere shows a distinct concern for female consent in sex, including when the woman is unmarried and unengaged. Dan spoke at length about the ancient culture having no regard for female consent. We saw that this is not true for engaged women, but what about single women? Could it be that this ancient society didn't care about the consent of single women? I don't think so. There are 3 basically undisputed rape stories in the Hebrew Bible. There's a good chance there are more, but we'll stick with the basically undisputed ones. In 2 of the 3, the victim is an unmarried, unengaged woman, and the rape is a source of outrage in the woman's family. We never just see the family say, okay, give us 50 shekels and she's all yours, as though it were a property crime. Here on the screen is the text about Tamar and Amnon. I don't know how someone could ask me to read this and think that the author of this text did not care whether Tamar had consented. But that is what Dan asks us to believe, again, without evidence. I think that this shows a clear concern for consent. We would expect then this same concern to be reflected in the law codes. So, if our Deuteronomy verses are not about rape, what are they about? Look at these next 2 points. Number 5, the parallel law in Exodus 22 is about seduction, not rape. In the version of this law that shows up in Exodus, it addresses a case where a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to be married and lies with her. And it assigns basically the same penalty. The man has to marry the girl and pay her family a bride wealth. Why the same victim, same structure, same penalty in this parallel law? It's reasonable to think it's because it is the same crime. Seduction, not rape. Now, let's go back to the word lay hold of. Unlike chazak, tafas is never used for a situation of sexual assault. Even scholars who think that this is a rape law note things like how the verb tafas is less harsh than the word in verse 25, and that the change of words is meant to distinguish the man's action here from the previous 2 laws. And so we ask, how is the man's action different from rape in verse 25 and different from ordinary consensual sex in verse 23? It's very reasonable to suppose that this is a restatement of the Exodus 22 law, and that it is not talking about rape, it's talking about seduction. He laid hold of her then in the sense of ensnaring her in a sexual relationship that was likely to be socially disastrous for her. Sandra Richter, who is a Harvard-trained scholar of the Hebrew Bible, she has argued for a seduction interpretation at length in this paper. For a very brief scholarly opinion, you can also read the Net Bible 2nd edition footnote on this verse, where they explain why they take it as consensual sex, not rape. Again, these are trained biblical scholars arguing from the original language. That does not mean they're automatically correct, but it is a live option. Again, it's possible that the law addresses a rape case. The Tafas word study is worth considering, but to make that case, you have to address this big pile of contrary evidence, and that is something that Dan just hasn't done. But either way, I don't think that it affects the outcome of whether a woman is forced into marriage, and here's why. Number 3, does this passage require marriage for women? Even if we granted that verses 28 to 29 were talking about rape, that still would not prove that the Bible forced women to marry their rapists. This law is all about punishment for the man, not obligation for the woman. He has committed a crime. He has to pay. He loses his right to divorce. So it makes total sense that the traditional interpretation of this text was that not only the girl's dad could refuse, but that the girl herself could refuse the marriage. This would mean that the only one being forced into marriage here is the man who has brought social disaster on this young woman. Now, Dan actually agrees that this law probably did not require women to marry their rapists. He and I have different ways of reaching this conclusion, but we do at least agree on that part of the conclusion here. So, do these laws treat women as property? Women were dependent on the men in their households in these ancient societies. I don't see that as something that the Bible prescribes, but it speaks into a world where that was what people did. And the question is then, in this context, did these laws safeguard and advance the dignity of women, or did they treat them as sex objects or as the property of men? I believe they were here to help women. Why would rape victims be compared to murder victims if they didn't regard rape and murder as comparable crimes? Why does this passage not go into victim blaming and punishing victims of assault, as many traditional societies have done and still do today? Why does the field scenario law assume that female reports of unwitnessed assault should be believed? Why in the Bible, unlike in Middle Assyrian law, is there no legal sanction for revenge rape, where the rapist's wife is raped as punishment for her husband's crimes? Why did Israel have laws that would protect a young woman from single motherhood? Why is consent so clearly valued? The reason for all these things is because these laws were not here to oppress ancient women, but to increase their dignity and their safety and their well-being. And that is what I suggest is going on in Deuteronomy 22. They did care about consent, and there's no biblical warrant here for condoning assault. Okay, this has been a really heavy topic to dive into. I hope my video helps. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I want to make more Bible and theology type videos, so it would be great if you want to subscribe and or throw me a like. Thank you. God bless you. Goodbye.